Today we're going to learn another example of how just a word or two in the Torah can have such deep, profound lessons for us. When Moshe Rabbeinu recaps how the Jewish people conquered the land of Og, he refers to the district of the capital as Chevel Argoiv. And we'll see two explanations, one Rashi quotes, one in the Mishnah, that help us understand what made this such a special place, and within that, an appreciation of the holiness of Eretz Yisrael compared to the holiness of the lands conquered like by the Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad, or other places that were conquered by the Jewish people. And we're also going to learn a very important lesson about how we balance our enthusiasm for our Judaism and our sense of Kabbalah soil. So in the Heintige Seder wird erzählt, wie die Bnei Yisrael haben menatzeach gewen Og melech haBashan bas kol amoy. Part of the parasha this week is Moshe Rabbeinu recounting how the Jewish people conquered Og and his nation, vanilko des kol arav, and captured all of his cities, kol Chevel Argov mamlechas Og b'Bashan, the whole Argov district, which is the kingdom of Og. So when it gets a Chevel Argov, this district, we're going to encounter two different perspectives of what makes it so important. Number one, Aleph, Rashi Taichlit Targum. Rashi on the spot tells us based on the Targum Unclus, as Argov meant Paltin Heichal Melech, that the word Argov actually means a palace. So the entire district was named after the palace because it is so-called the capital district. Based in Mishnah Zogt, then there's a Mishnah in Menachos that tells us Tekoya Alpha Leshemen, that Tekoya in Eretz Yisrael is the ultimate place to find oil that should be used for the Beis HaMikdash. The Shem von Shtot Tekoya is Yushan Mufchal Yishmanim from Beis HaMikdash. Tekoya produces the best oil that is supposed to be used in the Beis HaMikdash. That's according to the Tana Kama. Abishol Omer, and then Abishol adds Sheni Allah, and the second best is Regev Ve'Iver HaYarden. Regev on the outside, the east bank of the Yarden, which is Argov, is a Tatum first. So the Rebbe's father, Rebbe Leibik, explains as Regev Hu Chevel Argov. This place called Regev that the Mishnah refers to is Chevel Argov in our Mishnah. You can hear the similarity in the words. Shu Bechelka Shemenashe Shebe'Iver HaYarden, which is part of the territory conquered by Chatzi Sheva Menashe on the east bank of the Jordan, as Devorim, as the Torah tells us. On their meat is a mevoridem tam pnimi, and while he's about it, the Rebbe's father explains that this is the deeper reason why who was the person who led the conquest of Argov. Why it was Yair ben Menashe who was the person who took that land, because Yair is a name of illuminating, of light, and this is a place of oil, so it's only appropriate that a person who is associated with bringing light into the world will conquer the place that is the producer of oil. Yeah, the Inyan in Torah is Mundug V'Tachlis, as we well know, every single thing in the Torah is absolutely precise. Therefore, we have no option but to say that it's Shivas was während der Zelt in Torah Menegel demselben Ort Chevel Argov. These two illustrations of what made Chevel Argov such a special place. Aleph has das verbunden mit Heichal Melech. What Rashi tells us, it's a special place because it's associated with the capital city of the king. Oig. Und Beis, as das ist Schneerla, auf Nehmen von dort Shemen HaMikdash, and what Abba Shaul tells us in the Mishnah, that it is the second best place to get oil for the Beis HaMikdash. Obviously, haben zwischen sich Shayches in Teuchen, there has to be a thematic link between the greatness of the capital city and the fact that it's a place that produces special oil. So what's the link? We'll begin our journey by just analyzing and understanding this principle that this is the second best place to produce oil for the Beis HaMikdash. Because from Pashas L'Shena Mishnah, if you look at the Mishnah at face value, Abba Shaul says a statement after the Tanakama said his statement. Es mashma, as das plukte zwischen dem Tanakama mit Abba Shaul, zieht der Shem von Regev Shneerla oder nicht. So immediately we can identify that there's a debate going on, where the Tanakama says there's only one place that produces oil that is appropriate for the Beis HaMikdash, and that's Tekoya, whereas Abba Shaul says there is a second best place. As far as the Tanakama is concerned, there's no such thing as a second best. Aber frat, als ich wenn zu say das wir ja im Beis HaMikdash wird gebracht in Mishnah, in the same context, also in Menachos, when we talk about what kind of flour, what kind of wine should be used for the Beis HaMikdash, there it also says, as es for an alpha und Shneerla, and it also speaks about the ultimate and the second best sources for these products. Und bei sie wird ausgeteilt, was die Shneerla sein, Aleph behemstich zu Alpha, in those Mishnayos, it's a continuation, it's not two opinions. It says, here's the first place to get wine, here's the next best place to get wine. On Beis as a Stam Mishnah, and there's no names mentioned, it's said as a Stam Mishnah, which implies that everybody agrees. Whereas in our Mishnah, there are two opinions, implying a debate, and we need to understand the nature of this debate. Darf man verstehen? What is the basis for the debate between the Tanna Kama, who says there's only one place from which you can take oil for the Beis Hamikdash, and that's Tekoya, versus Abba Shaul, who says there's an alternative. You can also go to Regev. Especially because it appears to be that they're debating something factual. Sounds like they're debating whether the oil is good or not. That's an empirical fact. It's not a matter of opinion. How can you have a debate about it? So the clue to understanding this is looking at the words Abba Shaul used, where he didn't just say, go to Regev, that's the second best place for oil, but he said, Regev be'ever hayarden. He told us where Regev is geographically situated on the east bank of the Jordan. Why is that relevant to the conversation? With that, he wants to illustrate, just to clarify in case there was another Regev and you shouldn't be confused. I'm talking about the Regev to the east of the Jordan River. More importantly, Abba Shaul is drawing our attention to why it is surprising that oil from this location should be considered for the Beis Hamikdash. The time for the Tanna Kama, as if in Shema von Regev, is nicht matem zu sagen, Shniala. The reason the Tanna Kama does not want to consider the possibility of oil from Regev to be a second option for the Beis Hamikdash, as it is korov liyos meshubach, that it is almost as praiseworthy, almost as good as the other oils, which comes from Tekoya in Israel, is for a very simple reason. Regev is in Ever Hayarden Kidder Kamon, because the Tanna Kama is not comfortable with the idea of taking oil from a place that is outside of the original biblical borders of Eretz Yisrael. And das bewarnt Abba Shaul, to which Abba Shaul says, that yes, it's true that Regev is outside of the original footprint of Eretz Yisrael. Yet he still believes that because Ever HaYarden did become Jewish territory, therefore it can offer a second option for oil for the Beis Hamikdash. Now, to understand better the different views of the Tanna Kama and Abba Shaul, let's look from a perspective of Chassidus. The Chassidus explanation is this: as we well know, Hashem is Merames of Bittul, that oil is an iconic representation of Bittul for three reasons. You look at the physical properties of oil, and they all illustrate the message of Bittul. Number one, you want oil, you have to crush the olive. That is a state of Bittul. The olive loses its identity and its material shape. Second of all, when you light the oil, the oil gets sucked up the wick and gets completely burnt and disappears. No oil will remain behind. Again, that's a symbol of Bittul. Number three, compared to various other fuels, olive oil burns silently, on Rash, without making a noise. Therefore, because of these three properties, oil becomes the symbol not just of generic Bittul, but specifically Bittul b'metzias, absolute Bittul. So now, how does a person achieve absolute Bittul? So the darga from Bittul b'metzias, Bittul mikol v'choil, to have absolute Bittul, which is comparable to the oil that completely disappears from the picture through the combustion process. Humans are incapable of achieving absolute Bittul b'metzias of their own accord. With all the meditation about how great the Eibishter is and how limited we are, because no matter how much a person is able to mevatel themselves, to surrender themselves, it will always be the surrender of ego. Which means that a person is willing to sacrifice their own sense of self in favor of the Eibishter. But the person still identifies themselves as an independent individual who is surrendered to the Eibishter. They haven't disappeared. I am bottled to the Eibishter. It's not possible that a person's existence should be the cause of their lack of existence. It doesn't make any sense. So how does Bittul b'metzias happen? The Eibishter has to radio to a point that we are sublimated. The union for Bittul b'metzias kum dafka durch hagilim melmayla. The only way Bittul b'metzias happens is when there's a divine revelation. When a person is exposed to a tremendous divine revelation, Well, then the reality of the Eibishter is suddenly visible. The reality of the Eibishter is there's no possibility of anything else. So the person obviously disappears, because you suddenly recognize there is no me, there is only Eibishter. So bitul b'mitzias is a result of divine exposure, not human endeavor. The only thing is, in order for that bittul to be impactful and effective in the human experience, the person has to be in some way susceptible, some way open to the experience. Das heißt, that means that what I can do as a human being through my avodah is prepare myself to be a worthy recipient of the Eibishter's revelation, and that it should affect me in a meaningful way. But the actual bittul, the complete sublimation, is outside of my capacity. It's beyond my pay grade. It can only be achieved, it can only be achieved from divine revelation. Now that we have that principle, oil represents bittul, and not only any bittul, but bittul b'mitzias. And bittul b'mitzias is a gift from the Eibishter, not something we can achieve. We'll explain why there's a difference between oil for the Beis Hamikdash if it comes from Israel or if it comes from outside of Israel, Transjordan. What's the difference between these two regions? The difference is Eretz Yisrael is there at Shiva Amamin. Eretz Yisrael is a land that originally was given to 7 nations. And yet, in spite of it being occupied by those nations, the Eibishter from the beginning of creation had earmarked this piece of land to be the Holy Land. And that's how he handed it over to our avos, that this is going to be your land forever. Whereas the Transjordan territories were not originally allocated to the Jewish people as a covenant from the Eibishter. Not it's something that we took of our own accord, and we'll clarify in a moment. That doesn't mean we took it of our own accord. It means we requested it. There were these groups from the 2 tribes of Gad and Reuven and half the tribe of Menashe who went and they requested of the Eibishter, please would you give this land to us as an inheritance. Therefore, there is a fundamental difference between the experience of and the so to speak manifestation of divine energy in Israel, compared to Transjordan. As the Chazal tell us, Eretz Canaan mekudeshes me'ever hayarden, that Eretz Yisrael, even when it is still in the hands of the Canaanim, therefore it's still called Eretz Canaan, it is already holier than Ever hayarden, because Eretz Canaan ksher lebeis hashchina, because Eretz Canaan is predestined, designed to be able to accommodate the Shechina. The Kedusha from Eretz Yisrael, that means the holiness of Eretz Yisrael is nicht abhängig in the Eden Vavidosim. Doesn't depend on us. We have to do something in order to make it a holy place. That's what the Eibishter decided. It's completely on the Eibishter's terms. It's completely manifested by the Eibishter. Eretz Asher Tomid Einei Havaya Elekecha Bo, as the pasuk tells us, it is a land that consistently, even before the Jews got there, is a place of focus from the Eibishter. The Eibishter is watching that land with his eyes, which means he's investing in it. Mashenkin the Kedusha from Ever Hayarden, whereas the holiness of the territory is taken by Bnei Gad Bnei Reuven, which was taken. How was it taken by the Jewish people? Because we asked for it. That implies something of human endeavor. So Eretz Yisrael is divine endeavor. That's why it's holy. Ever Hayarden is human endeavor. We asked Hashem, can we also make this place holy? That's the deeper message behind the debate between the Tanakama and Abishol. The Tanakama halt Hashem and Mufra ken sein no von Eretz Yisrael. Tanakama says that the most choice oil oil representing absolute bitul b'metzias must come from Eretz Yisrael. V'adafkin Eretz Yisrael is of course made by Ifan God, because only in Eretz Yisrael do you have a clear, open divine revelation. Bizin anoifim fun re'iyah, to the extent you can actually see it, alluded to in the pasuk Einei Havai Lekechaba, that the Eibishter's eyes are directed there. So that's the appropriate place that can generate oil, which represents bitul b'metzias. That's the only place you can get such oil from, because bitul b'metzias has to be a gift from the Eibishter. Only Eretz Yisrael is a gift from the Eibishter, and the divine revelation of Eretz Yisrael is the Eibishter's initiative. So only there could you have the kind of oil that presents this degree of bitul. Abafrat. As Alter Rebbe says in the Geras HaKodesh, Dem Lashon Einei Havai Lekecha Ba, what does it mean? That the eyes of the Eibishter are constantly on the land of Israel. That really eyes are just metaphoric to represent that this is a place of the manifestation, not just of any degree of divine revelation, but specifically a revelation of Chochmah. Shemen is verbunden mit Chochmah, as we well know throughout Chassidus, that the physical symbol of Chochmah is olive oil. As the Gemara tells us, that the people who lived in Tekoya, because they would commonly have olives and olive oil, so they were more predisposed to Chochmah, bearing in mind, of course, that in Chassidus, Chochmah is directly related to Bittul. In fact, even the name Tekoya, which is the source of these olives that produce this oil, which is suitable for the Beis HaMikdash, the name Tekoya also speaks to this theme of integrating absolute awareness of the Eibush into our lives to the point of Bitul B'Metzias. Because Tekoya is Melashon v'Yiska b'Machshavta b'Choizek, like the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Gimel of Tanya, that what is da'as? Da'as is to impale, to fixate a person's mind on godliness. The word is Yiska, from the word Tekoya, which means to be fixated. And fixated on what? In the Mereliki was Vetnisgal in Eretz Yisrael, to be completely attached to and fixated and literally like driven into the awareness of the divine revelation that's available in Eretz Yisrael. In a sense, as Alter Rebbe there explains in Tanya, that you become one with that holiness and that light, and the Rebbe is the Gila, and because that is so integrated into the person's experience, it will be affected to ensure that the person achieves absolute bittul. So where will you get that absolute bittul? Eretz Yisrael, specifically Tekoya. Eretz Yisrael because it's a Gila Mil Maila, and only that can affect bittul b'metzias. Tekoya because you're completely fixated and attached to that Gila Mil Maila. But the Tanna Kama says if you're on the Ever Hayarden, there you don't experience this gift of divine revelation from the Eibishter, which could be the only cause for true, absolute personal sublimation. Therefore, from the Tanna Kama's perspective, whatever you're going to offer from your own avoida, and therefore in the olive oil that comes from Regev, cannot match its be'ein aroich. It's a quantum leap difference from the kind of oil that is available in Eretz Yisrael. It's not in the same league of the bittul that Eretz Yisrael offers, and therefore says nit in dem geder von shemen. It doesn't even enter into the definition of what kind of oil belongs in the Beis HaMikdash. Doesn't matter. It could be the second best quality, but it doesn't have this quality, and therefore it is as if it has nothing to offer from the perspective of the Tanna Kama. Abba Shaul disagrees. Abba Shaul behalt. As the Shemen from Regev Ken, yes, I Nashnialo. Abba Shaul says you're missing an important point over here, that it is possible for us through our avoida to generate something that is, of course, not the bitul b'metzias of the Eibishter's revelation. However, it can be second to it. How so? Says Abba Shaul, I agree with you. The holiness of Ever Hayarden is nothing close to the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. Und der Pfarrer says, Niken Alpha L'Shemen, and therefore it is not first prize for where you get oil for the Beis HaMikdash. But it is a kedusha which is beyond the scope of the created reality, and therefore it is a kedusha that can impact an experience of bitul b'metzias. Was is be'erech zum bitul mikol v'chol von Eretz Yisrael, and because it's bitul b'metzias, it is within the league of what Eretz Yisrael has to offer, but it's not the same degree of bitul b'metzias b'ofen as Eretz Shniela. It's second. What does that mean? Because ultimately the Giloi Leikus, which exists in Eber HaYarden, which is now actually considered a part of Eretz Yisrael, is a gift from on high. It's not like there was a group of people who belonged to these Shvatim who generated Kedusha into that space of Eber HaYarden. It's only because the Eibishter responded to their request and endorsed their request and said, yes, you can do this. You can turn this place into a holy place. And that means that the Eibishter said, I'm agreeing with your principle, with your suggestion. Therefore, I am now investing into this place, Kedusha. The difference between Eretz Yisrael and Eber HaYarden is Eretz Yisrael was the original, so to speak, plan of the Eibishter, that this is where he's going to manifest the highest levels of Elikos, and Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven were able, through their request, to, so to speak, cause the Eibishter to share a Gilui Elikos in that environment as well, and a very high Gilui Elikos, which can also achieve Bittul B'Metzias. Even with that expression that they took the land for themselves, what does it really mean? Nobody would suggest that Bnei Gad of Bnei Reuven went of their own accord and took a piece of land and then afterwards went to negotiate with the Eibishter. It means that they took the land because they asked for it. But the fact that they got the land and that the land was considered Eretz Yisrael, that's because Moshe agreed with them and the Eibishter endorsed their request and responded in kind. Says Abba Shol, that's actually the correct way to distinguish between Eretz Yisrael and Eber HaYarden. Because oichin chutz la'aretz, the chiddush over here is that even if you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, hatayt bekeach zu uftan, it is possible for a Jewish person to effect and daf uftan as elikus zol dot meir sein begoloi. Not only can we are required to manifest godliness in a revealed fashion outside of Eretz Yisrael as well. Or kapiskon Rabbi Seinu Nisenu, like the famous saying of our Rabbeim from the Tzemach Tzedek, machdo in chutz la'aretz Eretz Yisrael, that we should make where we are into Eretz Yisrael. That is the requirement, that is the objective of every single Jewish person. However, because this would be a mechanism where we are the ones who create the catalyst that causes the Eibishter to manifest holiness in that place. It's us who have to do the work in order that the place is transformed into Eretz Yisrael. So yes, it will be godliness that we bring into the space, but what degree of godliness? That which is in the scope of being impacted by human endeavor. In other words, a degree of elikus which responds to our avodah. Unlike Eretz Yisrael, which is a degree of elikus that the Eibishter of his own accord decided to invest. Maschenken, die Dagesakdusche von Eber HaYarden, kann nicht mamshech sein und ufton boy allein, sie können nur beten und gönnen sein, als soll nimshech werden milmaila. So it is not possible in Eber HaYarden for us, using our own resources, to turn this into a place of holiness and to turn this into a place of godliness. The Eibishter has to consider and respond to our request in order for any of that to happen. So because the Kedusha that actually flows into Eber HaYarden after we've done our avodah is something greater than we could really reach of our own, the Rebbe can see and say, therefore that Gilui Elikus is powerful enough that it could affect us to have and experience true Bittul B'Metzias. Nor, but we cannot escape the fact that the entire dynamic requires human input, and therefore it must be relative to human experience. That's why we have a part to play, and we can actually request it of the Eibishter, even if that's a so-called, secondary catalyst that causes something to happen. So yes, there will be Bittul B'Metzias, even in Eber HaYarden, but it will be a completely different and in some ways limited Bittul B'Metzias compared to the bitum b'metzias which is in Eretz Yisrael. And mihai taima is a shem from regav eivar yaden bloy shnia la. Therefore, even according to Abba Shaul, who suggests that you can use oil from eivar yaden in the Beis Hamikdash, implying that you can achieve bitum b'metzias, it's second tier. It's not the original. It's not the ideal. Okay, so now that we understand this distinction between Eretz Yisrael and Eiver HaYarden, let's go back to the two possibilities of what makes this place, the Chevel Argoiv, such a special place. Now we can see the thematic link between Rashi and the Mishnah explaining what makes Chevel Argoiv so special. Because on the one hand, we're speaking about Chevel Argoiv being associated with the great oil that it produces. On the other hand, we're saying it's a place that is associated with the palace of the king. Those two themes link. When the Jewish nation conquers a place, it's not only a physical thing. This used to belong to nation X and now belongs to us. That the ownership moves to us. Most importantly, when we conquer a land, that is a spiritual takeover, which means that means that everything in that land becomes the property of holiness, represented by the holy people. And that's directly relevant to Argov being the place of Oig's palace. When we conquered Chevel Argoiv, we transformed that from the capital city of a human king, from the Umas HaElam, not just a human, but one of those nations, who was actually not our friend. So we transform it lahavdil, that now it becomes the palace of the ultimate Melech Malchei Amlochim, the Eibishter. And therefore, is Argoiv was given a Palten Shamelech v'Malchus Shaloilam. Therefore, this Chevel Argoiv that now became the palace of not just a king but the king. That's now similar to Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael is the original palace of the King of all kings. And now we have transformed Chevel Argoiv from being a human palace into a divine palace. So that transformation, that's why the oil and therefore the bittul provided in Eiver Hayarden is similar to, although it's only second tier, to what's available in Eretz Yisrael, because it's become the Eibishter's palace, linking those two explanations. As das, was Abba Shaul sagt, dem Shem von Regev Eiver Hayarden, as is the Shnia law, the fact that Abba Shaul is the person who claims that the oil from Eiver Yarden could be the second tier to the oil from Tekoya and Eretz Yisrael, that's because Abba Shaul has a singular shita, an approach to Judaism that we're going to see he's expressed elsewhere as well. We're going to see that this aligns with another principle that Abba Shaul teaches about oil for the Beis HaMikdash. Mishnah sagt im Masechta Midas, Mishnah Masechta Midas, which we're supposed to be learning at this time of the year, tells us that in the women's courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, in the four corners, there were four chambers. So the Mishnah there tells us the southwestern chamber, in the Mishnah, as Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov had gesagt, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says there were four, and then he says, I've forgotten what the chamber of that corner was used for. Ot Abba Shaul gesagt. So Abba Shaul steps in and he explains, I'll tell you. That was the chamber where they kept the oil and wine to be used in the what's called the nesachim for the karbonos, or in the menachos. And therefore it was called the oil chamber. Now the question is, why is it that Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov forgot the purpose of that particular chamber? So again, the Rebbe invokes his father's explanation in Torah's Levi Yitzchak, in Oasis from Kabbalah, where he speaks very much in Kabbalistic language. Is so the Rebbe's father explains as follows, that the Ezras Nashim is a representation of Malchus, whereas the Azorah of the Beis HaMikdash is a representation of the Midas of Zoh. Malchus is represented by the name Adnai, which has 4 letters, and corresponding to those 4 letters, you have the 4 chambers in the Ezras Nashim. More specifically, in the name Adnai, the letter Daled is the symbol of Malchus. Daled from the word Dalus, which is something which is weak or disempowered of its own accord, like Malchus is. and you take the word, it's Ani Daled. Adnai spells Ani Daled. So Dalet, that letter Dalet, is why there are 4 chambers in the Ezras Noshim, to represent how from Zoh, which is the Midas in Atzilus, how you get this flow of energy into these 4 levels of Malchus. What are the 4 levels associated with? They link up to Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. So Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod are what seep energy through into this particular manifestation of Malchus. Each of those 4 chambers working in a clockwork movement. They, as you would walk around the base, the Mizbeach, right? When they sprinkled blood on the Mizbeach, they went around in a clockwork movement, in a clockwise movement. So you have a similar thing in these chambers, which means Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. When you get to Yesod, it's funny, the Dromis Ma'aravis, which is the southwestern Lishkas Shamnaya, that's when you're corresponding to Yesod of Zoh. Now, Rabbi explains over there that the trickle of energy from Zoh into Malchus at this particular point goes in a way of moichin de katnos, which is what you'd call like immature intellect. And therefore, because it's immature intellect, in other words, almost to say things have been, in a sense, simplified, because that's what happens. There's a simplification that has to happen from the higher degrees of divine revelation to Malchus, which is a lower degree of divine revelation. So therefore, in Moichin de Katnos, when you have a more limited or more immature experience of intellect, you are more susceptible to forgetfulness. So this Lishkas Beis Shamnaya is a place which is physically corresponding to the part of the whole transmission of divine energy where there is a susceptibility to forgetfulness. So that's why they dafka, what do they put into this chamber? They put wine, but more importantly for our conversation, they put oil. Not only did they put oil there, but the name of the chamber completely ignores that it's stored wine and focuses completely on the oil. So having the oil there helped to prevent that you should not, says the Reb Leivik, forget the purpose of this particular chamber, because as we well know, that olive oil helps to restore a person's memory, because we know that eating raw olives is kosher l'shikha. Chassidus explains because the oil is trapped inside the olive at that particular point in time, and so therefore that implies that intellect gets trapped and you can't remember what it is that you wanted to remember. And as we'll see in a moment, chokhmah is specifically associated with remembering things, with memory. So the chokhmah, the oil, is locked inside the olive, you can't access it. But the remedy is to add some olive oil to the olives that you're eating, and that neutralizes the effects, and it helps that you don't forget, that it's not kosher l'shikha. And then the Rebbe's father goes further to say, and why, who, dafka is it that illustrates what the purpose of this particular chamber is? It's specifically Abba Shol. Because Abba Shol, you can hear it in his name, he represents the level of chokhmah within that element of Yesod Zah. So there's a combination, obviously, of a whole lot of different divine energies here. There's Yesod flowing into Malchus. Specifically, this is the Yesod of Zah going into its particular, so to speak, landing place within Malchus. But embedded inside that is Abba within Yesod Zah. Remember, every midah, every sphere is made up of all the other spheres. Abba is the entire parts of the entire experience, the fully mature experience of Chokhmah. So Abba Shol represents that. That's linked to the power of memory. Because the secret of memory is to invoke that very powerful, mature, so to speak, developed aspect of Chokhmah. So now it's the that does raise a question, though, from a spiritual perspective. Is the Inyan Hashemen. Sounds like the whole solution over here and the impact on not forgetting is thanks to the oil. Because oil restores memory. So who needs wine in that chamber? How does wine come to that chamber? It's a completely different energy. And Abba Shol mentions it, even though he's addressing Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov forgetting. So surely he should have been speaking about the oil. Why does he mention wine? Not only that, he first mentions the wine before the oil, even though the oil is the primary ingredient that we're looking at. In fact, not only that, But Rabbi also explains that wine is the opposite of memory. That wine is a cause of forgetfulness. And there Rabbi explains, firstly, there's a pasuk in Mishlei where Shlomo HaMelech says that you shouldn't drink wine with the wine of kings or the wine with kings because it could make you forget the Eibishter. And then he also brings over there that you remember from the story of Yosef. First of all, Yosef was forgotten. Remember, Yosef is Bechinas Yesoid. So there's the link. And not only was Yosef forgotten, but he also says Kinashani Elikim when he names Menashe. Kinashani Elikim, one of the explanations is that he forgot the Torah that he had learned with his father, Yaakov. Not only that, but Yosef encounters somebody called the Sar HaMashkim. What's the Sar HaMashkim's job? Procuring and providing wine to the king. And he has a dream. In his dream, it's the production of wine. And there's three containers of grapes that he's using in order to produce that wine, says Reb Leivik, that refers to Chochma Bina Das, Moichin de Katnos, the immature version of intellect, that he's using in order to prepare wine. And the end of the story is Yosef asks him to please mention him to Paroi and get him out of the prison, and he forgets, all illustrating to us that wine is actually a cause of forgetfulness, the opposite of shemen, which is to restore memory. Why mention that this is also a place to store wine, which goes against what Abba Shaul's whole message is, and why mention the wine first? As the Rebbe, that's exactly why. The uftu da is the whole chap over here is as the amshocha von Zikaron is in dem Ort, wo mitzad atzma is dort shaykh und noch memamshich shicha. The whole chap of oil is not just that it's good for memory, but that it can impact an environment that is not good for memory and change that. In other words, a place which is is more likely to be a place of forgetfulness. That's where you bring the oil. Und Afar is a Makdim Shomo Yunosin Yayin, so therefore he tells the story chronologically. That's the place of wine. Hat Gosh as Dirish mit Sadatzme Shayer Chanot von Yayin von welchen von welches is Nimshach Shicha. First he tells you the context. This is a place of wine. This is a place that is susceptible to forgetfulness. And then he tells you the next step. But when you add oil into that environment, not only do you add oil as another component of the space, but it becomes the main component, and therefore becomes the name of how we describe the entire chamber. That reinstates the capacity for remembering, and it protects against forgetfulness in the future, that you'll never again forget what the purpose of that particular chamber was. The power of oil to restore memory in an environment that is vulnerable to forgetfulness. Is you said Abba she b'yosoidza. That aligns with what the Reb Leivik said. That what does Abba Shol represent? It represents the concept of Abba, which is the full parts of the full developed experience of Chokhmah, where in Yesoidzah, the place that is susceptible, or the energy that is susceptible to forgetfulness. Is Yesoidzah mitzadatz mishaych ve'yochel, in Yesoidzah mitzadatz mishaych ve'yochel shika, as we've mentioned. Yesoidzah is susceptible to forgetfulness. Aber durch der Hamshacha von Yesoid Abba be Yesoidzah. But when you bring that awareness of mature understanding or wisdom into the environment of Yesoidzah, then even an energy which is designed for the capacity to forget becomes a place of memory. And that is how that explanation of the four Leshachos, or specifically the Lishkas Beis Shamnaya in the Beis HaMikdash, shows us that Abba Shol has a consistent view of how you want to understand oil, which applies here to Chevel Argov. The fact that it is possible to get oil suitable for the Beis HaMikdash from a place like Argov or Regev Shebe'ever HaYarden is exactly the same thing. We're talking about Ever HaYarden. Ever HaYarden is a place where at best we can get to the point to lose the ego, but still possibly forget who we are, what we should be doing. Right? As bleibt aber mit because the person still remains as an independent conscious entity. The bit of Shemen Kanal, you can go into that place and bring into that, introduce into that place the kind of bittul of Shemen. But Dugma Sinyan Anal, very similar to what we've just mentioned, but it gets to Lishkas Beis Hashmanim, to the chamber of oil, as in dem Ort, wo Neusin Yain, was mit Zadatzme is dort Shayach Shicha. when you're in an environment that contains wine, which is predisposed to forgetfulness. The reason is because wine is something that is very much part of the human experience. We drink wine, we enjoy wine. It's something that's relative to our experience. And therefore human beings are inconsistent, and we are possibly going to have bittul and then not bittul, or remember and forget. We inject into that environment, and we introduce into that environment the capacity for oil, which is chokhmah, which is absolute memory without wavering. And from that, the Rabbi calls in Avedus Kol Echad Vechad, we have a lesson for each of us. So du hast Torah vetongeru von Sai Yain und Sai Shemen. We know that the Torah in different places is referred to as wine and as olive oil. Now the chiluk b'chlal zwischen Zeh and Avedus Sodom is, what's the general distinction between what they represent? Yain was bringt zu simcha. Yain makes you feel happy. That's why yain is associated with our metzias, makes us feel good. So that means, that represents where a person is learning Torah with a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and it's the person's heated up in the Torah learning. You mean, it's that they're excited by it. Where oil, which as we mentioned burns silently, represents the bittul that we're supposed to have before we start learning and while we're learning. As the Gemara tells us, you have to remember to say the bracha before you start to learn. So, logically, you'll conclude, these are two completely different contradictory states. Yain is an informatzias, koch. Wine is awareness of self. I'm enthusiastic. I'm excited. I'm enjoying. And shemen is inyan bittul, whereas oil represents complete bittul. They cannot coexist. And the and therefore a person will say, you know what? I know I have to have both components. But I can't have them both simultaneously. Now here they're different stages and different experiences. Before I start learning, click into oil mode. Bittul. I should be like dust, and therefore I could learn. But then when I'm learning, in order to learn, I have to switch on my brain, which means I have to be present, because I need to understand what I'm learning. That's a place, the koch and geschmack, the yain von Torah. That's not a time to feel the bittul. That's a time to feel the enthusiasm, the excitement. Lernt Abba Shol, comes Abba Shol to teach us a whole different approach to learning. As man darf hereingeben Shemen in der Zabelishka, wo sie ist do der Yain, that you put oil in the same chamber that holds wine. Und noch mehr, the Yain darf vernat toffel zum Shemen. And when that happens, wine has to take a second row to the oil, which has to be the primary. To the extent that you call the whole chamber of oil. So mustaka sein der Yain, yes, of course, there has to be understanding and enthusiasm and excitement. The kochen avonas vasakas Torah, we have to really get excited about learning and understanding Torah. Aber man darf ständig gedenken, als sich der Koch in Limud Torah, darf sich durchgenommen mit Bittul zum Neues in Torah. But what we have to be conscious of is the paradoxical state that while we're excited and learning Torah, it is with complete submission to the one who gave the Torah. It's not a personal thing. And the Bible warnt the Mishnah was ken aris kommen leise. And the Torah warns us, the Mishnah warns us, if we don't get this balance right, then we get shachachtim moyes mishameshes. We could forget the purpose, forget what the chamber is for. We can be very specific about this message. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov knew there's a chamber and it obviously has a role to play. This is a place that is designated only for serving the Eibishter. But his question is, but what does it do practically? Is the my nafgemina? What's the difference? If it's used for X or it's used for Y? Bitul! As long as it's for the Eibishter, we don't have to get into the details. How you do it, Al Rebbe would say, if we had been instructed to chop wood, we'd chop wood with the same commitment, with the same dedication. It's just the selbe lishke. And again, so Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov is saying, it's a chamber for God, that's all you need to know. You don't have to get down into the details. You're serving the Eibishter. Focus on that. You don't have to worry about the specific detail of how am I serving the Eibishter. Well, the practicality is when there's something that doesn't translate into practical detail, we forget about it. And the same can happen in learning. It is possible for a person to learn a tremendous amount of Torah, both quantitatively and also depth. That's what a person is into, that's their talents. But what does it translate into? To translate all of the theory of Torah into practical application, it's not me, it's not my neshama. So it's possible with that misstep, not concentrating on I'm here to serve the Eibusha, and therefore, even if it isn't my skill set, even if it isn't the focus of my neshama, I have to translate Torah into real applications. That misstep can be a slippery slope. A person can be very sharp and switched on in their Torah learning without any practical take-home. Zogt Abba Shol in the month, if Abba Shol steps into the fray, and he reminds us, you have to take all the learning and translate it into something you're going to do realistically. Which means that the learning that we do has to translate into action. If we only have the wine aspect of Torah, kann sein, als man soll nicht abtreten von dem Geschmack von Abona Basage bei Torah, we could be so caught up in the beauty and the experience and the joy and the pleasure of learning Torah that we don't step out into actually doing what we should. And sometimes to actually do what the Eibusha wants means we have to force ourselves, as alluded to in the Gemara's expression, me'asin, that you can force people to give tzedakah. But when our Torah learning is completely integrated with bittul, and therefore the entire focus and purpose of a person learning Torah is, how do I align with what the Eibusha wants? Then we have great learning. What is the great learning, says the Gemara? Is an open for maybe the day Maisa, when it transforms into action. Until actually the learning inspires us to such an extent that we physically get involved in actions that are fundamental and core to what Yiddishkeit is, like the story of Rabbi, who saw that there had to be a methodology in order to educate children so that the Torah would have continuity. On Messiah, to which the Gemara concludes, how great is not the learning that Rabbi did, the way he translated his learning into action, which of course should be a lesson for all of us, that we should have this tremendous excitement about our learning and the Kabbalah soul, that our focus of our learning is to do what the Eibusha wants, and that in turn should be the catalyst that brings Mashiach now.